So our second snippet looks at the period from 1763 until 1776, which is, as we all know, sort of triggers the American Revolution. But the purpose for this course, given our themes, is just to talk about the constitutional aspect of the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain. And the British, I think had a series of difficulties in the aftermath of to confront in the aftermath of this war. The first is this is the map at the end of the war. The dark red area is controlled by the British colonists. This was the pre-war boundary. The pinkish area are the area that the British had seized from the French. And if you look closely on the map, you'll see a thing called the Proclamation Line of 1763. This is the 1763 Proclamation. That line technically forbids, any white British settlement in the pink areas. And the reason for this is that these pink areas are under the de facto control of various Indian nations, of whom some of the most famous are the Iroquois in New York, the Delaware in Ohio, and Western Pennsylvania, the Creek and the Cherokee in the southern part of the United States. And the Indian nations, of course, eventually will come under the entire control of the U.S. government, albeit in kind of odd ways in terms of how the relationship is structured. But in this period, from 1750 until 1776, arguably through the Revolutionary War, the Indian nations are functioning in some ways as a kind of independent entity. The British, the French send military delegations to these entities. Various Indian nations side with the British during the war. Most side with the French during the war. In the aftermath of the conflict, the British want to avoid renewed fighting between the white British colonists and the Indian nations, because if you get renewed fighting, you'll have to keep more British troops there. So the result is this proclamation of 1763, which would have created, if it had been able to be implemented, it turns out it's really not, what could kind of be called a protectorate in this Midwestern part of the area. So, I mean, the British would have had a kind of formal control, but there would have been a degree of autonomy for the Indian nations. The problem, of course, is the colonists want this land. And so this is problem one from the colonist standpoint. They see this proclamation of 1763 as unfair to them. They are British citizens. They should have the right to settle in any area under British control. The British see this as strategically necessary. So it's an early sign of a conflict, strategic conflict between the two sides. The second, comes in these two charts, and basically what the chart on the top shows British defense spending over a 20-year period from 1744 until 1764, the end of the war, and the chart at the bottom shows British public debt. And what you should notice from these charts is that British defense spending spikes during the French and Indian War, and public debt increases dramatically during this time as well. And so the British government concludes, look, these troops are very expensive. We're going to send them all the way across the sea. The British government basically say, look, why should we continue to tax British voters, the people who are going to elect or re-elect us to Parliament, for defense funds that are designed to protect these colonists 3,000 miles away? A better system would be to tax them. And so even though the British had the formal power to tax the colonists since 1660 in the Navigation Act, they generally hadn't implemented that approach. Instead, basically, the British approach had been to tell the colonists, you're responsible for your own defense, your own revenue, tax yourselves, pay the governor's salary, but you don't have to pay any extra money over to London. All of a sudden, this changes for entirely understandable reasons. After the War of 1763, or British decisions basically say, look, these British colonists can't vote in our parliamentary election. So if we have to impose taxes to sort of deal with this increased public debt, we might as well impose them on the colonists rather than on British voters, especially again, since the cost of this conflict was primarily caused by the colonists. The problem with this is that the colonists had become an increasingly large share of the British population as a whole. So you can kind of see from these two charts in 1700, the British colonies are a tiny percentage of the population of England and Wales. But by 1770 or 1780, they're a very significant component, around one third as many people. And so the British argument that, well, we should have a system in which this very large number of people are not represented in our parliament, a system called virtual representation. The British argument is that these hundreds of thousands of people don't need to have a vote for a member of parliament because they're British. All British citizens can be assumed to be represented by those MPs who do have a vote. So this would be the equivalent, say, in the United States, of a system where say New York residents had no vote at all for Congress, but Texas residents did, and the federal government said, well, you don't really have to worry about this because Texas voters will keep your interests in mind in New York, and so you're virtually represented in the parliament. This, unsurprisingly, is not appealing to the colonists who push for a system of actual representation. Their argument is basically, look, if you're going to tax us, you should allow us to have a vote. That's a system that, in retrospect, the British should have done, and they could have done it on paper in a relatively easy way. There are more than 600 members of the British Parliament. Give the colonies 50 members or something like that. That's not going to alter the balance of power. The problem is that if the British made this concession, it would have changed the nature of British politics, and that's because the British government had not what we would now call redistricted for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in the U.S., under the census, every 10 years, the boundaries of state legislative districts and of House districts have to be redrawn to make sure they're relatively equal in population. And this is a requirement in the Constitution. And one of the reasons for this is that the colonists in the 1760s got this firsthand experience with a system called rotten boroughs. And the pictures that are on the screen here are of two of the most infamous rotten boroughs. The black and white one here at the bottom was a rotten borough called Dunwich, which in the 1400s was an area with a significant amount of population, but then a lot of it, you kind of see from the photo, eroded into the sea, and so there were virtually no people in this parliamentary district. But since Britain didn't redraw its districts at any point through the 1770s, Dunwich continued to elect a member of Parliament. Similarly, with this district, which is called Old Sarum, which had 3 people who lived there. It was just a castle, and that was it. So the system of rotten boroughs, it's not as if these people actually got to elect anyone. They were ways for allies of the crown or allies of powerful forces could kind of be, a sure seat in Parliament. So from the British standpoint, if they made this concession to the colonists and they allowed the colonists an opportunity to elect members of Parliament on their own, they presumably would have to redraw the British lines as well, and that would have dramatically altered the nature of British voting. So the British government has no interest in this. They basically tell the colonists, tough luck, and we're going to tax you if we want, and we're not only going to do that, but we're going to tax you in the most obnoxious way that we possibly can. And they come up with this thing called the Stamp Act, and this is a rendition of a stamp, what we would now call a sales tax. And any newspaper, or if you're sending mail, or if you have a legal document, you have to pay this tax and get it stamped for it to be legal. So there are a lot of ways that you can do indirect taxes to where you can raise a lot of money, but it's not obvious that the money is coming from taxes. Instead, by doing it this way, the British kind of hammer home to these British colonists, look, you're being taxed, and you know about it. And the result is a resistance campaign organized around principles called organized by a group called committees of correspondence, which are basically exactly what they sound, people just writing letters to each other, pushing the idea of a non-importation agreement, what we would now call a boycott. And basically what the British colonists are saying is, look, if you're going to tax us without our having an opportunity to vote for Parliament, we're going to respond to that by ceasing to purchase British goods. And British merchants who have become quite reliant on the colonial trade pressure the British government in 1766 to get rid of the Stamp Act. And the British government does, but they accompany it with this law called the Declaratory Act. And the key portion of that act I have here in red, where the British government says, we're going to withdraw our Stamp Act, but we have the right to tax you whenever we want. And don't think that the fact that we're withdrawing this suggests that we agree with you constitutionally, that because you don't have representation in Parliament, you should be free from taxes imposed by the Crown. The British position, again, as I mentioned earlier, to me was entirely reasonable. That they were imposing taxes on these colonists to pay for expenses that primarily were related to the protection of the colonists. But this is not how these taxes are interpreted in the colonies themselves. Instead, the colonists tie into sort of pamphlet, radical pamphlet literature in Britain in the 1750s. We would now call this sort of fringe activity on the internet. I mean, this idea of embracing of a conspiracy theory dates, way back in American history. And the conspiracy theory in the 1750s and 1760s is this idea that the British Crown, you can sort of see in this cartoon, this is supposed to be the king, is intent on destroying the liberty of the colonists, and there is a choice that the colonists face between liberty and slavery, and they need to make sure that they are aware of this and to take acts to prevent themselves from being enslaved. Again, this is a bizarre interpretation of a taxation dispute, but it's one that really takes root within the colonies. Even though in Britain this idea was very, very much on the fringe, and so colonists are interpreting the British decisions through this very strange ideological lens, not of a government that's desperate to raise funds, but instead of a malevolent government that's desperate to destroy their liberties by using the taxation power. Now, a more nuanced, stable, sophisticated with it. British government might have been able to recognize this and sort of avoid problems. But as you can see from this chart, the British government was unusually unstable in the period after the War of 1763. They went through a number of different prime ministers until finally choosing this hardline prime minister, Lord North, in 1770. And for all of these prime ministers, they have 9,000 things on their docket. The sort of constitutional relationship between London and the British colonies is never preeminent, and so these problems continue to fester. And as the British reimpose taxes under Lord North, the last of these pre-Revolutionary War prime ministers, including a tax on tea, um, the colonial response is quite inflammatory. This excerpt I have here from Common Sense. This is Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet. The Paine argument is that government exists. The British government is existing as a punisher. This is a revolution. This is a pro-independence tract calling for people to unite. There is a degree of uniting with the creation of the Continental Congress in 1774. This predates the Declaration of Independence by 2 years, but in a lot of ways, you have a system where the colonies are setting up a kind of independent governmental authority. You can argue that independence really is on its way in 1774. And this is intensified by overreactions on the British side. This is General Gage, who becomes the military governor of Massachusetts, which was the most radical of the colonies. And the British government, after the Boston Tea Party, wipes out the colonial government of Massachusetts and imposes a military dictatorship, which has the effect of inflaming sentiments and paving the road for the revolution. So basically, the story of this period from 1763 to 1777 is that the two sides are talking past each other. The British are just desperate for revenue from a source they think has been underpaying. The colonists see all of these moves as designed to steal their liberties, and this culminates when the British, overreact and impose this military government on Massachusetts. This seems to prove the radicals' argument that this is all a British plot to deprive liberties. The result is the Declaration of Independence, and we'll be looking at the constitutional effects of that in the next snippet.